All right, we are back at it today with the second video on our steps to the Cold War, from wartime allies to Cold War adversaries. And we're going to start off today with the Truman Doctrine. This is President Truman's Cold War policy, and he lays it out in a speech where he says that the United States has an obligation to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Now, he doesn't ever mention the Soviet Union specifically or communism or anything like that, but everybody knows who he's talking about. And so this is going to mark a dramatic change from the pre-World War II isolationist policies of the United States to now the United States being an interventionist nation. This is drafted in response to instability going on in Greece and Turkey and the overall concern that the Soviet Union is trying to influence the takeover of European states to make them communist. The Soviets saw this themselves as threatening and accused the United States of trying to expand the American sphere of influence. So notice what's happening here. Both the United States and the Soviet Union are accusing the other of doing the exact same thing. This is the start of America's containment policy. What was laid out by George Kennan is now being put into action by Harry Truman. Next, we're going to talk about the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is Secretary of State of Harry Truman, George Marshall's plan to send economic aid to European nations following World War II. This is going to be the economic extension of the Truman Doctrine. Financial aid would link up European and American economies to prevent Soviet influence from growing. And this is primarily going to be seen in Western Europe. The United States did open up Marshall Plan aid to any country who wanted it, although there were some strings attached. The United States needed to be able to see where that money was going. And of course, the Soviet Union would not accept such provisions, nor did they allow their Eastern European allies to accept Marshall Plan money. The Soviets referred to the Marshall Plan as dollar imperialism and responded themselves with what was known as the Molotov Plan, which were a series of bilateral agreements or two-party agreements between the Soviet Union and Eastern European states. This was followed up by Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, that was organized by the Soviets in January of 1949 with the goal of linking Eastern European economies to that of the Soviet Union to support collectivization and growth of heavy industry in these Eastern European states. This brings us to the development of the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union created a satellite empire in Eastern Europe. Now, these countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Bulgaria and Romania, they're going to have separate legal identities. They're going to be their own independent nations, but militarily and economically, they will be tied to Moscow. The Soviets' army will be in all of these Eastern European states through salami tactics that we've already talked about. We're going to see the rise of Communist Party dictatorships in all of these states. They're connected to the Soviet Union economically through that Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And they've all got secret police networks and spy networks connected to the Soviet Union, trying to make sure that these countries stay in line with Moscow. Further along, we see the Czechoslovakian coup. Now, Czechoslovakia would be the last country in Eastern Europe, the last country that was liberated by the Soviets in World War II to maintain a democratic state that was not a communist dictatorship. But there were concerns about a pro-West rearmed Germany that made many in Czechoslovakia, particularly many communists in Czechoslovakia, very nervous. In February of 1948, Joseph Stalin pressured the Czechoslovakian government to oust non-communists in a bloodless coup. The United States would see the Czechoslovakian coup as further evidence of Soviet aggressive expansionism in Eastern Europe. But all of these steps really come to a head in 1948 with the Berlin crisis. Please note, this is the first Berlin crisis we're going to deal with in this class. Later in 1961, we're going to get the building of the Berlin Wall, a second crisis in Berlin. Germany is going to be temporarily divided after World War II by the Allied powers. So we've got a Soviet zone in the east right there. I'm still not good at that. And then British, French, and American zones in the western portion of Germany. This was only meant to be a temporary division that once something could be agreed upon by all the parties, that Germany would be reunited. But the eastern and western zones really had irreconcilable differences. The United States wanted a future Germany as a economic and strategic partner in the world, whereas the Soviet Union wanted a Germany that would never be able to pose a threat to the Soviets, which really was just a Germany that would enter into the Eastern Bloc nations of the Soviet satellite empire. In 1948, the Western powers, recognizing that coming up with some mutually agreeable situation for Germany, recognized that was going to be impossible. So they began to move to unite their three zones of occupation into what could become a new West German nation. They drew up a new constitution. They created a new currency for Western Germany. Joseph Stalin responded to this by launching the Berlin blockade in June of 1948. Remember that the city of Berlin was completely located within the Soviet zone in East Germany, but it was also occupied by those same four powers. So in the Berlin blockade, the Soviets are literally going to close off the access points between West Berlin and West Germany. There's 2 million people that live in West Berlin, and so they're going to be without supplies for the duration of this blockade. The United States and Western allies are going to respond to the Berlin blockade with what is known as the Berlin airlift, where everything that those people are going to need to survive for the next however many months would be flown to Germany, flown to West Berlin, and dropped by planes on the city, or just planes flying and landing between one airbase in West Berlin and back to West Germany. Over 200,000 flights would be flown over the next 11 months during the Berlin airlift, as over 2 million West Berliners will get all the food supplies and fuel supplies that they need to survive for that year. The results of this blockade, Stalin backs down. He does not react. And this is a good example of the Americans using that logic of force that George Kennan would have talked about. Joseph Stalin backed down here. But we will get a permanently now divided Germany. There will be an East German state that is a part of the Soviet satellite empire, and there'll be a West German state that is supported by the United States and Western Europe. There's going to be a continuation of four power occupation of Berlin. So the situation in Berlin really doesn't change. We're going to see the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is a military defensive alliance where all of the NATO nations, United States, Canada, England, United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, they'll all agree to stand with each other in the face of an invasion of any of them. And by 1954, NATO will admit West Germany as a member nation. The Soviet Union sees this as a provocation, and they respond to West Germany's entrance into NATO with the creation of the Warsaw Pact, their own version of a defensive alliance in Eastern Europe. So now we've got a Cold War. And here's how the world is now going to be viewing any kind of conflicts that arise over the next few decades. They're going to be seen as the struggle between communism and capitalism between the United States and the Soviet Union. The American policy of containment is going to lead to the United States resisting the spread of communism in many places around the world, including Korea and Vietnam, which we'll talk about very soon. The United Nations is never going to play the original role that it was intended to play, because the United States and the Soviet Union will oppose each other at every turn through vetoes in the Security Council. And as we're going to see, the United Nations will then fail to be that effective deterrent to resolve international conflicts, especially if it's a conflict that includes the United States or the Soviet Union or their allies. We'll talk to you next time.